And then as I got older, I started reading books that felt like they were a little bit closer to home, things that I was trying to understand a little bit more about. So I was looking in a lot of ways for books that were about people who looked like me. And I think my mom recognized that that was important, and she would always go and seek out any books that were about any Asians whatsoever, basically, or any books that were by any Asians on any topic whatsoever.
Well, that is a hard act to follow. Oh, dear. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I'm Susan Goldberg, the president and CEO of GBH, and let's just start with a round of applause, please, for the talented Wa Lam Kung Fu and Tai Chi Academy dancers. Thank you very much. So thank you all so much for joining us here in this theater tonight, and thanks also to those of you watching at home. This is a wonderful opportunity to celebrate Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Now, it is a few days in advance of the actual month of celebration, which happens in May, but in truth, at GBH, we celebrate AANHPI contributions all year long. So again, let me please thank GBH's Community Advisory Board member, Mai Du, who is the leader of the Academy, for sharing that wonderful work with us. Stories that can change the world are at the core of GBH's mission, as is the inclusion of voices and perspectives across American culture. And tonight, we're going to honor an important role that Asian American artists play in telling stories that resonate across communities. It's no secret that we're living in challenging and divisive times. But one thing that can give us hope and bring us together is literature and art. Tonight's two featured artists are doing just that through their creative work, illuminating the power of stories to challenge injustices. Best-selling author Celeste Ng's novels, Everything I Never Told You, Little Fires Everywhere, and her new book, Our Missing Hearts, make us think about race, class, belonging, and what stands between people and achieving their American dream. And there's no one better to have a conversation with Celeste than distinguished Harvard University professor of English, June Kim, who's teaching and writing extensively about cross-cultural literature. Her research and teaching interests include Asian American literature and performance, contemporary American theater and drama, and cross-racial and intercultural performance. I'm really looking forward to an insightful conversation between these two wonderful women. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge the tremendous support that we've received for planning this event from members of GBH's Board of Trustees, Board of Advisors, Advisors Council, and Community Advisory Board. We are so grateful for your leadership and your generous commitment to GBH and for all you do as incredibly important ambassadors of our work. This annual event began about 20 years ago in the living room of GBH board member Leverett Wing as a way to engage the AANHPI community in Boston. And I'm committed, as were my predecessors, to focusing on this vibrant community through our documentaries on World and GBH, in our news coverage, on our social media platforms, and at live events such as tonight's. Special thanks also to our event sponsor, Bernadine Sung Megason of Compass Real Estate. Now, every year, this event shines a spotlight on partners like the Asian American Community Fund, as well as those new to GBH, including the Coalition for Anti-Racism and Equity, Friends of Indian Senior Citizens Organization, Philippine American Mainstream Advocacy for Nonpartisan Association, and Pan-Ethnic Pour-Overs. You'll be able to meet all of them at tonight's reception, and for our remote audience, an email will be going out tomorrow with more information on each group. Now, to get this evening started, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Les Cheng, General Manager of Television and Streaming for GBH and our national award-winning nonfiction service World. And Liz is also the force behind Stories from the Stage. Liz?
Thanks so much, Susan, and thank you all for coming out tonight on this beautiful evening. I always say that every year this AANHPI event is sort of like a family reunion, right? But I'm seeing a lot of new faces in the audience today. I think probably Celeste and June have something to do with that. So if we could just take a minute to say hello to someone new next to us. I'll wait. Introduce yourself. Say what you do with GBH. Okay, that's great. So now we really are all family, right? Because we all know each other. Recently, the GBH family lost a longtime supporter, Mai Takayanagi. During World War II, she and her family were sent to live in an internment camp, and that was during World War II. As a result, she became a peace and justice advocate, fighting to make sure no one else experienced discrimination and internment. We cherish and remember her courage and hard work. Each Heritage Month, GBH World airs more than 50 documentaries and programs about the AANHPI community. While World features these stories all year long, we like to say we put an exclamation point on it during May, during the Heritage Month, especially with 3 premiering documentaries that are exclusively on World. America Ephraim Bengali Harlem, teenage Aludin Ula in the 1980s was swept up with the hip-hop scene in New York City and rejected his working-class Bangladeshi parents by turning his back on everything South Asian and Muslim. As an adult, he journeys from the streets of New York to the villages of Bangladesh to uncover why and how his parents ended up in Harlem. On Local USA, Chinatown Auxiliary, a group of Chinese grandpas and grandmas had been patrolling the streets of Manhattan, Chinatown for several decades as NYPD volunteer police. In response to the gangs and crimes in the 1970s and now to the Asian hate era during COVID-19, they protect the few blocks of their Chinatown neighborhood for family and friends. In Doc World, Crossings, women from around the world, led by South Korean activists, are demanding peace by doing the forbidden, crossing the long-standing demilitarized zone between South and North Korea. Boy, our friend May would have just loved this film. Here's a personal documentary, America Ephraim Bengali Harlem, a news feature, Local USA Chinatown Auxiliary, and an international film, Doc World, Crossings.
Is Aladdin. For those of you wondering, no, I don't own the 7-Eleven. No, I don't drive a cab. And I had absolutely, positively nothing to do with the Oklahoma City bombing, all right? I never really acknowledged myself being a true Bangladeshi.
As Prince, I will not allow you to do business with my father's oil company.
I would get these parts, the money was really good, but after a while I was getting so angry. And I remember one director says, "Who was your father?" Well, I don't really know. There's a void in my life. Like, I really have to know who my father is.
He was maybe a teenager when he first came here, that he came on a boat, came in the 1920s. He married a Puerto Rican woman and moved to Spanish Harlem. That was a time when South Asian immigration was actually banned.
They landed in New York, and he decided to get off to look around. He claimed he got lost, and the ship left.
There was a lady, he stayed in a rooming house, and there were other Indians there.
He opened the restaurant in 1958, and shortly after that, we got married.
She knew the system, she was American, she knew how to help these people.
My dad was president of the Pakistan League of America.
They started doing this annual boat ride.
That was the most thrilling time.
Everyone around this table is related to someone who was in that 1952 photograph. They all built that world together. There's so many stories. We've been omitted from history.
People saying Asians are always looking to invade, not assimilate. That Asians are nothing more than rude merchants, illegal aliens, and criminal smugglers.
Another 4th grader this week asked me if my parents are vaccinated, and I said yes, they are, but I am so scared for them to go outside, so I tell them to stay home safety just because they're Asian.
It's been an emotionally exhausting past week, past year, and honestly, decades upon decades upon decades of being silenced, unheard, today is much needed.
差不多过去100年，我们中国人呢，在这里给他们欺负得太厉害，所以我听到5分就要办那个普警，那么我就参加办了普警，那么他们晓得我是警察了，他们就不敢这样的人来了，这样我可以保护我自己。在过去2年，现在这种思想又好像不输了。我身体很好的话，我还可以帮他们，我就帮他们。
As a daughter of South Korean immigrants, I grew up being told stories about our homeland.
This is Korea, a nation divided at the end of World War II at the 38th parallel.
These stories made us fear North Korea, and it was something that I never questioned until much later.
More than 60 years after the ceasefire, North and South Korea and the U.S. are still technically at war.
I decided I needed to meet the people that were supposed to be my enemy. And that's when I started to understand the legacy of a war that never ended.
Breaking now in North Korea, women from around the world are preparing to make a demonstration for peace.
A prominent women's activist group is planning a symbolic and controversial walk across the demilitarized zone.
Women are disproportionately impacted by war and violence, and it's time to have a seat at the table.
Peace! A lot of people say it was naive, and you cannot do this.
Several hundred people are here to counter-protest against us.
Anyone who calls on engagement with North Korea, they've been maligned.
If there's not agreement between the two militaries, the government does not feel that our safety would be assured.
What are we doing that is so threatening?
People think that the only way North Korea can be dealt with is to eliminate it. There is an image that there aren't real people and that they must be destroyed.
시민들 같은 경우는 마음의 분단심이라고 하나요? 마음의 38선들이 있어요, 사실은.
This artificial boundary has kept Korean people separated.
So all of you here and all of you on Zoom will be getting a full schedule of these 3 films that we're premiering, plus the 50 more or so that we're airing throughout May. So without further ado, I'd like to bring to the stage our special guest, author Celeste Ng and Professor Jun Kim.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. First, I'd just like to begin with some thanks to GBH for the warm welcome and also for the invitation to be in conversation today with an author that I really long admired. And we were just talking about how surprisingly, despite living in Cambridge, we haven't met. So this is actually a kind of amazing opportunity.
It's a wonderful opportunity to get to meet in person.
So I thought we would just begin with an origin story. And I think something that lots of people would like to know about if they don't already know. And that's, how did you kind of come into writing? Was it always a calling for you? Was there something that changed in your life that took you down that path? I know that there have been a lot of questions kind of coming in from audiences everywhere, fans everywhere. And I know that many are sort of artists, authors themselves who would love to hear about your journey.
I grew up in a household that was just full of books. My parents loved reading. My sister loved reading. We were the kind of house where my father, when we ran out of bookshelf space, would just go and get some lumber and build a new bookshelf, and then we would fill up that bookshelf, and then he would build another bookshelf. So I learned to read very early. I actually don't remember a time before I knew how to read. And so part of the way that I processed the world was through stories, both by reading stories and then by writing stories later on. So I was the kind of kid who was always kind of curled up with a book somewhere. I got in trouble when I was in preschool because it was supposed to be nap time, and my mother got a call that I was not taking a nap and I was instead reading my book. And my mother had some words with them, which I didn't realize until many years later, and suddenly I was allowed to read my book. So I have always just really loved writing and stories, and I would write plays and make my cousins perform them. I would write poems. I would, write sort of little, I guess we'd now call them fan fiction, continuations of books that I love that I didn't want to be over. But it wasn't until a lot later in my life that I started to think that writing was actually something that I could do as a job. I had a plan going into college that I was going to go into journalism and write my fiction on the side. And then I realized that I would be a terrible journalist. I don't have the personality for it. Key among those, the fact that I like to embellish the what happens. Not good for journalism. But I decided I would go into publishing and I would edit. Then I thought maybe I would go get a PhD. And then once I achieved tenure, then I would write on the side. And it wasn't until, well after I'd graduated and I was trying to figure out what to do that a teacher of mine at Harvard actually said to me, you keep saying, I'm going to write on the side. What if you take the writing and put it in the front? And she was really the one who sort of gave me almost permission to say, try this and see what happens. So I'm really always grateful to her.
That's amazing. That's lovely. I think mentors can really shift our lives in these ways, take us down paths that we didn't expect.
Absolutely.
Were there, while you were growing up, or perhaps even later in life, were there any literary inspirations, books that really made you, think and feel, made you think that you wanted to be a part of that kind of world of creating fiction for people?
There were so many authors that I loved when I was a kid. I was a pretty precocious reader, and I was also a rereader, and so I would have this stack of books next to my nightstand. My mom was very big on classics, and so I was reading books that were considered classic at the time, sort of the Little House series, lots of Lloyd Alexander, so like The Black Cauldron and things like that, The Wizard of Oz, not only the first, but many of the other books. A lot of books that I think allowed me to escape the world I was in. And then as I got older, I started reading books that felt like they were a little bit closer to home, things that I was trying to understand a little bit more about. So I was looking in a lot of ways for books that were about people who looked like me. And I think my mom recognized that was important, and she would always go and seek out any books that were about any Asians whatsoever, basically, or any books that were by any Asians on any topic whatsoever. And so I had a number of books about Japanese internment, for example. There are children's books that were written about them, and I'm grateful to them because I grew up knowing that this was a thing that had happened in our country. I grew up also sort of thinking about how are these experiences like mine and how are they not like mine. I think when you don't see yourself directly represented, you start looking for commonalities elsewhere. And I think that was really good training for me as a writer and a person.
I definitely want to go back to some of the, I guess we would call it early Asian American literature that you read.
I guess that's the best name for it.
But before that, I just wanted to say, I grew Lloyd Alexander, that's like a name I haven't heard in ages, but I remember those books now just because you mentioned it, how much I love them growing up. But I also grew up reading mysteries.
Oh, yes.
I loved Nancy Drew, and then there's like scary stories that had some sort of mystery thriller aspect, and then Agatha Christie. And although I do sometimes see your books categorized as mystery thriller, but I would probably just head straight to sort of like the fiction section, right, for your books. And yet all three of them have this very strong mystery element where you kind of immediately present us with some kind of puzzle. and let that unfold. And I was just wondering, was a mystery genre important to you, or is there, some inspiration for structuring your books in that way?
I actually love that you said that, because I wouldn't have thought of that. But I do. I used to love mysteries. I think I started off with Encyclopedia Brown. I don't know if any of you remember those, where everyone is like 2 pages long, and there's always some tell, and then you flip to the back and you see if you were right. And I learned a lot of facts from those. Or like then the same author wrote these things called 5-minute mysteries, which are essentially Encyclopedia Brown for grown-ups. But I still love mysteries now. Agatha Christie, as you mentioned, Dorothy Sayers. I think for me, it came in part from that idea of trying to solve a question, a riddle. Why did this happen? We think of a lot of mysteries as a whodunit, but I found myself always really interested in why they did it, which Encyclopedia Brown fell a little short in that particular thing. He stole the valuable baseball because it was valuable. My mother is a huge mystery lover. She used to get this magazine called Ellery Queen magazine, and she would read it every month and then, wait eagerly for the next issue. She still loves what she calls like a nice, comfortable murder, which I think is, by which she means, it was like, Mom, what is a comfortable murder? And what she explained to me was that she felt like mysteries appealed to her because in a way they were often very moral. There was a sense that there was a wrong that had been done, and that's, someone was going to try and make it right. Someone was going to try and redeem what had happened. Someone was going to try and make restitutions, or at least understand what had actually happened. And I think that is, growing up with my mom, loving mysteries, watching a lot of PBS mysteries in particular, and then reading a lot of mysteries, I think there is that's in the DNA of all of what I write.
But I love that you've taken it a slightly different, you've given a twist to it by asking not who or why, or not really who and why in sort of that instrumental sense, like, okay, it's valuable, but, sort of what led up to something, right? And I feel like even though there's sort of all of your books are structured as mysteries, there's a kind of unfolding where it's really about ambiguity, but never in the unsatisfying way of, well, we don't find out what happened to Lydia, right? Because that would be that would be kind of unsatisfying.
Right.
Like you find out the answer, but then you kind of come to a point of realizing that actually there's so much more around the answer that's really what's important to know.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I love that. I love that twist. But I think the structure definitely, I think it's so familiar to us. It keeps us kind of turning the pages. Like we want to know, but we actually end up slightly in a different place.
Yeah, I think every writer wants their book to be a page turner in a way, which is, you want the reader to read the book, which involves turning the pages. And when I'm reading, I very much want to know what's going to happen next. My favorite books are the ones that keep me up really late at night, and because I can't stop reading, I got to find out what happens. And I think I did consciously do that because I know that I'm talking about things that are important to me. That's why I'm writing the book, but I want the reader to come along. And in order to do that, you do, in some ways, have to entertain them. You have to entice them along a little bit. You have to give them a reason to keep reading. I think maybe the reason that I tend to focus on sort of the why and the ambiguities in it is partly because I would be a very bad mystery writer, not a good journalist, also not a good mystery writer. I think when I was maybe about 12, I knew that I wanted to write stories, and I wrote a mystery story, and I said to my mom, I'm going to send this into Ellery Queen, and then they're going to discover me, and I will be on my way to, being a writer. And she read the story, and very nicely, she said, this is great. I think this is a good start. I wonder if, when you write a mystery, you maybe want it to be more complicated. And she said this because there were only 3 characters in this story, and one of them was the policeman, and then one of them was the murder victim. And so it was pretty clear where it was going to go. And so I realized that I am not a direct plotter in that way, but I'm very interested in the nuances of what happens. Like you say, all the stories of why this happened, not just what happened. Okay, we've checked off all the boxes. We've got enough clues. We can go. But getting into sort of those human, sort of the messy, sticky parts about why somebody would do this. I think why would you do this is the question that started each one of my novels.
So I wanted to go back to the Asian American literature question. I wanted to preface by saying, I've been teaching an intro to Asian American literature class at Harvard for about a decade now. when I first started, most of the students would walk in and say, and I would ask them, what are some Asian American authors or works that you would consider Asian American that you've read? And the students would almost uniformly say that they hadn't read any.
Oh, wow.
And maybe, there was somebody who'd read a Jhumpa Lahiri story or something, by Maxine Hong Kingston was assigned in high school. And then I noticed a shift about 5 or 6 years later when more students sort of came in saying, well, I know about all of these authors. And I think that now students come in having read your work very prominently.
That makes me really happy.
No, and it's a huge shift. Your work, Pachinko by Minjin Lee, they might have read The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen, some Ocean Vuong, Chen. And so it feels like the intro class feels very different. It's no longer, here is Asian American literature that you've never read before, and now it's more sort of the longer history in which you can kind of insert some of these contemporary writers that you really you're already very familiar with. And so I was wondering perhaps what your relationship, I know that your mother gave you a lot of these books on internment and some of the history, but I was curious about your relationship to something we might call a body of literature that we think of as Asian American literature. Are there particular inspirations there? How do you see yourself as being in conversation or perhaps not with some of those authors?
Oh, I love this question because it's something that I've been thinking about throughout not only my writing life, but also throughout my life as a student and just my life as a reader. So my mother, starting in the 80s when I was born, was sort of basically taking any Asian writer that she could find. And so I had Yoshiko Uchida, who's writing about her experience being interned. There are some older writers, Jade Snow Wong, who wrote a book called Fifth Chinese Daughter. Betty Bao Lord, who wrote adult novels as well as children's novels. And so my mom would just have these on the shelf, kind of like there with a suggestion. And she read them herself. But I would read them, and I was really excited to see characters that felt like me in some ways, but I also felt like they were not describing my experience exactly, right? Even when we got farther along to Amy Tan, who I think is writing very directly about the Chinese American women's experience, or a Chinese American women's experience, I think I should say more properly, I would see some commonalities, but I felt like those weren't the stories that spoke exactly to me. They did and they didn't. They didn't quite fit. There's sort of like keys that fit, but they don't totally turn. And so a lot of what I started doing when I started writing was just trying to write stories that I wished that I had or that felt like they were speaking to me. Not to fault any of these writers, of course, but just to say that I think up until relatively recently, there was a very narrow band in which I think Asian American writers, and particularly Asian American women writers, were allowed to publish. You were really only allowed to write certain kinds of stories. And if you wrote them, people would say, well, I don't know, this doesn't really fit with what I thought you were going to write about. And even when I started writing stories, if I wrote a story that didn't have any Chinese American characters in it, people would sometimes be confused, where they're like, well, why are you writing this story? And I'm like, well, I grew up in the suburbs. I do know some of what this is like. And so I think in conversation is exactly the way that I think about it. One of the wonderful things that's happened over the past, I would say, 10 to 15 years particularly, is that I think we've started to see a widening of what kinds of work is getting published by Asian American writers. And I think we've also seen a broadening of what that idea of Asian American writer can mean. I think it used to be like, well, if you're Chinese, Japanese, or Korean, you're an Asian American. I don't know what everybody else is. And you can only write these kinds of stories. And now I think we're starting to see a lot more. We're seeing like Chen is a poet and he writes about queer experience. Ocean Vuong also. We're starting to see a lot of Korean American writers who are doing really interesting work. Aro Kwan, for example, she writes about Korean characters. They're not always doing what she calls sometimes being Korean, meaning that that's not necessarily the focus, but it's always a part of it. And I think that's a really wonderful sort of broadening of the lens. And that's the conversation that I think of myself as being in. I try and read a lot of those books because I want to see what they're talking about. They're talking about aspects of Asian American experience and of American experience that I don't know. I learn a lot from them. And so I love that your students are coming in now and they have certain touch points, because when I was an undergrad, there were basically like two works. There was like Amy Tan, and one particular Amy Tan story in particular that was like the one in every like English anthology And if you were assigned anything, it was pretty much that one. And then there's Maxine Hung Kingston, and it's either The Woman Warrior as a Whole, which is a book that I love, or it's one essay in particular that, one bit of it that was excerpted. And it's wonderful now that they can come in with a little bit more context about all of the different experiences that are out there. That makes me really happy.
I think it's wonderful. And I'll just say also, Aro and I went to high school together. It's a very small world.
It is a very small world.
Yeah. But I think just to pick up on something that you're saying, with my students, I who come into that class and who want to be writers themselves, I see a little bit of that struggle where they might want some of the books to relate to them in a very specific kind of way, or to be able to see themselves. And I think there's this sort of progress from feeling frustrated that these works that are labeled Asian American still aren't speaking to me, then to thinking about how, in fact, that expands like the possibility for their own art.
Yeah, it leaves a space for them. And I think that's so important. I think a lot of the books that we've been seeing coming out by Asian Americans and Asian Canadians as well are sort of, I think of them as little, almost like little crowbars that are prying open and making a little bit more space, making a little bit more breathing room. A book like Crying in H Mart, for example, which is a memoir by Michelle Zauner, in which she's talking about sort of aspects of being Asian American, particularly being Korean American, that I don't think had gotten talked about before. There's another wonderful writer named Nicole Cheng, who is a transracial adoptee. She's ethnically Korean, but she was adopted by 2 white parents in Oregon. And so her experience of what it means to be Asian American is quite different from many other people's. There's, for her, there's not this typical immigrant narrative of you came here and then you did this, right? Hers is coming from a totally different angle. And as a Midwesterner of Chinese descent, I've been really thrilled to see a lot of like Midwestern tales about Asians in the Midwest. And that's been fun too. I like the idea that your students can start to see this as an opportunity and a space for them, like a space that their story is still important, because it certainly is.
No, absolutely. I wonder if there's also sort of a generational shift around artist relationship to that label or category designation identification of Asian American. I remember, I would read artist interviews and people would be somewhat reluctant in some cases to call themselves Asian American writers. I think it felt limiting, right, to a certain extent of, why can't I just be an American writer or writer? What does it mean to be an Asian American writer? Is that limiting? I feel like that's that people are less resistant these days.
Yeah,
and
I think so.
I'm not sure if it's related to kind of the sense of more expansive possibilities that you're talking about, where it's not quite narrowly defined, or if there's a sort of a cohort of writers for whom like there's not a fraught relationship, right? As fraught of a relationship to that identity.
I think you're exactly right. I've noticed that as well. And I think part of it is you're saying this idea that maybe there is a little bit more space at the table. I remember I had the opportunity to interview Maxine Hung Kingston once, and then we got to go and have coffee afterwards, which was really fun because she's one of my literary heroes. And I remembered her telling me that when she first started publishing, she was the one. And then when Amy Tan came, they were like, well, you're out. And now Amy Tan is the one. And she was like, that's fine. Like, it's being the one has a lot of disadvantages as well, right? And then there was a long time where Amy Tan was considered the one. And I know many, many writers, particularly of East Asian descent and particularly Chinese American writers, who tried to write stories and who were told, well, we don't really need this story because we already have Amy Tan. And I actually wrote an essay, which is still kicking around on the internet, called Why I Don't Want to Be the Next Amy Tan. And it wasn't meant as a diss to Amy Tan at all. But my point was, I don't see why I don't need to like knock her off the pedestal and then like take over. This is not like Highlander, where like there can only be one and I have to displace her. I would like her to keep writing work, but I would also like there to be space for me and many other people. And that's not about Amy. That's about sort of what the publishing environment thinks. And so I think you're exactly right. I think for a long time, that idea of being pigeonholed was really a big fear for any writer who was coming from any sort of a marginalized background or a minority position, because I worried after my first novel that I was only going to be read by people who were Asian American, if that, and that I would never find readers who might relate to the story. I didn't know if anybody would relate to it. And one thing, I'm curious to know your thoughts about this as well, Gian. One thing that I think has changed a lot, sort of in this generational shift, is the idea that you can be more than one thing at a time, which I think is really powerful, particularly if we're talking about Asian American identity. Right there in the name is the idea that you can be two of these things, and you don't necessarily have to choose which one you are. And one might be uppermost at a time, one might not be. They might be in tension with each other, but those are both parts of your identity, right? That idea that you either had to choose that you were going to go with the Asian side or you were going to be just American. I think that's a shift that we've started to see that allows us to think a little bit more expansively. And maybe that's part of why now more writers are feeling like, I can be an Asian American writer, and I can also be a queer writer, or I can also be a woman writer, or I can also be these things, and those things can all exist within you. I think for people who, are children of immigrants or mixed heritage, that negotiation of your identities is something that we're very familiar with. And the idea that now many people are starting to think about, I have many identities, how do they fit together, that allows a lot more space for everyone.
I definitely think that, and we could trace this to maybe some of the changing demographics, but also within academia, I think there's been a lot of push towards, again, a more diverse or expansive sense of Asian American. But I think that there's been a lot of internal contestation, right, of this idea that there's kind of a singular Asian American experience.
Absolutely.
It tends to be like a second generation immigrant experience, for example, mostly East Asian. I think that with the demographic shifting quite a bit from sort of multi-generational Chinese, Japanese American, maybe Filipino American, to Korean, Southeast Asian, South Asian. They're it's so, I think it became so false to everybody, this idea that there's only one or maybe a couple of Asian American stories that can be told.
Right.
And for many people, their relationship to what might be considered home country is so different, right? I'm 1.5. I'm not sure what. If you said you're the child of immigrants.
Yeah, so both of my parents are from Hong Kong, but my son his father is white, and I'm fully ethnic Chinese, or however we like to put that. And that idea that but I also, at the same time, I grew up in an area where there were very few other Asians. I didn't get Cantonese, which is my family's dialect. I don't know a lot of the sort of traditions and rituals, and so whenever we go to a family thing or a traditional gathering, I have no clue what I'm doing. And so my relationship to it was very different from my cousins, even though similar situation, but they're growing up in the Bay Area. And so they've absorbed certain things from being around. They have more of the language than I have, right? And so as you're saying, I think that as more people started to have different kinds of experiences, different relationships to their home country or their country of origin, right? I think it makes sense that this is sort of a natural evolution. Yeah.
And I think I also, a lot of the people I went to college with ended up going to Asia for work, right? They were Asian American, and then they sort of became expats in Asia. And that's like a whole nother kind of really interesting story that can be told and has been told.
It is, yeah.
So I think it's just great that the literature, and I think it always takes a little bit, right, for writers to be cultivated in that way. But I love that the stories are becoming so different.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That idea of, Asians who sometimes, or Asian Americans who go, I don't know, I want to go back in some ways and sort of learn or find out what they are. And then they realize in some ways that their experience doesn't totally prepare them for fitting into sort of their mother country either. I think that's a really common experience. I heard someone put it as, when I'm in America, I'm aware of how Asian I am. And when I go to Asia, I'm suddenly very aware of how American I am. And I've found that as well. Like when I still have family in Hong Kong, and when last time I was there, I think I was 25. And even if I wasn't saying anything, if I came into the store, they immediately would start talking to me in English. And I don't know what it was, but they could tell. They're like, she's not from here. And they were right in a way, but it changed how I felt. I'm like, oh, this I don't totally fit here either. What does that mean for me? What parts of this feel like they are mine? What parts of this am I connected with and not? And now, again, I think that we're starting to have sort of the nuance to dig into those questions, where before I think there was very much, thinking about the teaser that we saw, there's that idea of Asians come in, they just want to invade, they don't want to assimilate. And I'm like, okay, so there's only two options here. You either take over and impose one particular view, whatever that is, or you completely get rid of everything that you had. And that idea, again, that all of these things are part of you, has been a big change in my lifetime.
Well, I think even thinking about your three books, right? They're so distinct, and I know I said, pointed out before that they're all mysteries of one kind or another, but I'm not sure it would be obvious to me that the same author wrote all three. And so there's a way that even within your body of work, there's kind of a diversity of storytelling and perspectives that get presented. I have no idea if there's any weight behind this, but I was thinking about books as almost like children.
Yes.
In birth order.
I think that's actually a really apt analogy. I do sort of think of them as my children in some ways.
Yeah, and then sort of the expectations that we might impose. And I only have one child, so this is a very just sort of loose thinking about this, since I don't have direct experience of multiple sort of offspring to compare. But again, like they're so different. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if there's a way that in that particular moment when you were writing, and I know it takes a long time to write each work, that was a novel that was possible, whether because it was your first book versus your third book, whether because of what was going on socially in the world at that moment. But I'd love to hear you just talk about the trajectory of those three works.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I like that comparison a lot, actually. I should say that I also only have one child. And so some of this is what I imagine. I have one sister, so we were two. But then I have many other people that I've watched sibling dynamics, and I was like, it's kind of like my friend's family. Where my first novel, when I wrote it, I really was not sure anyone would ever read this book at all. I wasn't, frankly, sure that I would actually finish this novel. And if I finished it, I was not confident that it would be published. And if it was published, I was not certain that anyone would read it. So that was actually very liberating in a way, because I would tell myself when I sat down, no one's ever going to read this. Just write whatever you're thinking about. And in a way that allowed me to kind of dig into this story that feels very, it's very insular, not in a negative way, but it's about this one family and their very particular sorts of struggles. And that book is 10 years old this year, which is hard for me to imagine. And I think you're right. It's a book that I think I could only have written at that stage in my life. And I started it before I had my son, and then I finished the last draft, which is the final, after I had my son. And so I think there was something about that shift in my life, thinking about what it means to move from only being a child to being both a child and being a parent at the same time. And thinking about those things, and particularly still feeling like I was almost an adolescent myself, I think it was very much a book of that era. And then the second novel, Little Fires Everywhere, I sort of started digging back deeper. I started thinking about community rather than just the family that shapes you. What happens when your community shapes you? It's based on my actual hometown. And it was, at that point, I had been away from home for about 15 years, I think, and it was long enough that I could start to have some perspective on the place that had raised me. Not just nostalgia, and not just that, young persons, I need to leave this place and never come back, but something more complicated in between. And I think it was an evolution there. And then the third novel, which I started before the pandemic, but really came together during the pandemic, was a lot of me thinking about my son. And how do you raise a child in a world that seems like it's going to be very hostile to him? How do you raise a generation and still say, you can still make this better, even when I'm really not sure that that is the case, right? When it feels like the world is falling apart, you can't say to your kid, okay, you don't have to go to school anymore. You don't have to do anything. Just give up now. Nobody wants to say that to their child. And so I think it was very much, as you say, there was sort of a development and evolution as I moved through each of those novels. I sometimes think, as you say, like, I'm like do they all sound like me? And I guess they do, but the me that wrote each of them has changed throughout. I've changed partly through writing each book, and so it makes sense that the voice is different, or that's what I tell myself anyway.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and something you said helps me appreciate an aspect of the works that I've always kind of puzzled over, in like a kind of an intellectual way, I guess as an academic, but the way that especially your first two works like seem to exist in two different temporalities. And part of this obviously is very purposeful, that there's a kind of retrospective framing to both of them, but it really feels like you're both in, say, like the post-war time and like contemporary moment with your first with Everything I Never Told You. And then when we move into Little Fires Everywhere, there's a lot about Clinton, it's the era when I grew, when I came of age in the 90s. And yet there's also something about it that read to me like the Obama era, sort of veering into like the Trump presidency, right? With, I felt like there was sort of this, there was kind of a discourse around like post-raciality, right? The sense that Shaker Heights had made it. We don't really think about
racism.
Race doesn't matter anymore, right?
We're past that now.
Yeah. There's inequality, but we're also working on that, and it's just a matter of making sure that we resource people in the right way, or something like that, or kind of support them properly. And yet, at the edge of that, there's still sort of this sort of edging into a kind of different era, which is really present in your third book, which is both kind of like dystopian, it's kind of future perspective, but also very much a critique of the present. I couldn't help notice that you described it sort of as a movement from family to community to world in a way. And each of the books I thought got a little bit more, I don't know if this is the right characteristic, but maybe more politically oriented or more socially critical.
I think it came more to the surface for sure. Yeah.
And could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, did you see yourself initially as somebody, right, who would be interested in doing a work that had a very strong political critique, especially in your third book? Or is it something that, again, sort of kind of evolved in the moment and you felt that this was kind of what was being asked of you?
Yeah, I think if you had asked me with my first novel, is this a political novel? I would have said no. And if they had said, do you have, strong political feelings? I would have said, well, I do, but I don't think they're in the book. And I think both of those things would have been wrong. But I firmly believed that at the time. As I said, I wasn't really convinced throughout most of writing the first novel that it was ever going to be seen by anyone other than me. And when it came out, it was interesting to see the world's reaction to it and how they were seeing different things in it. Largely, I think, because our world is political and because I look the way that I do and I am the person that I am and I have the background that I have, by which I mean not just race, but also, socioeconomic background and my personal life and all these things. I saw it become political. And I realized that wasn't something that I was necessarily asking it to be, but that other people were reading political meanings into it. People would say to me, well, what are you trying to say about Asian Americans in the novel? And I would think, well, I mean, A, nothing, but also B, kind of a lot. But it's not, that wasn't what the book was about to me. To me, the book was about a family. But I realized I am saying some of these things. And so it's in this sort of complicated gray area. And so, as you say, by the time that I got to the third novel, I do think of that as a political novel, and I didn't do it on purpose per se. I didn't, I'm picturing like when you have like a turkey at Thanksgiving and you like inject it with like broth to like keep it moist. I didn't like inject I'm so glad this is going to be recorded forever and live on the internet. This is how my brain works. But I didn't think of it as like, I've got a story and I'm going to inject the politics into it. It was more that the story that I was thinking about, the story about a mother and a son, and the ways in which the world was sort of shaping their relationship, that was political. And I think it was more that by the time I got to my third child, I wasn't afraid of that anymore. I wasn't afraid to be thought of as political. And I wasn't afraid to kind of write about those things because they felt so pressing in my own life at that time. All the questions that animate that third book were questions that I was thinking about at the time and that I'm still thinking about as a parent. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think related to that, there seems to be, we might call them, say, theories or ideas about the relationship between art and politics that is elaborated in each work. And again, like most strongly in Our Missing Hearts, where it really is about, well, how can art have some kind of social effect, right? Can it actually bring about social transformation? But I just wanted to be a fan for a second. And thinking about your first work, something that really stuck with me was the way that characters interacted with books, not via the text or what was written in them, but just as like material objects. So I'm thinking about like the cookbook and how Lydia thought about the tears marking it. And it wasn't about the recipes. It was about her mother's tears, or about, Lydia. I'm assuming everyone here has read all 3 books. I'm just gonna.
There's a cookbook and there are diaries.
There's a cookbook. There's a journal that, spoiler alert, is mostly empty. Diaries that are mostly empty.
Yeah.
And what it meant to kind of imagine the person interacting with these books as material, again as material objects. And I love that, right? Because I think it kind of suggested something important about the books as things and not just as text to be read. But again, by the time I got to Our Missing Hearts, it really is about like the power of stories, and how do you transmit sort of silent stories to have some kind of political impact. And so thinking about Our Missing Hearts, I'm curious about the emphasis on like the liveness of the storytelling, and again, a little bit of a spoiler alert, but I totally understand why the stories about the missing children had to be told live plot-wise,
in a moment.
Right? Yeah, it fed to like sort of the suspense, and it kind of led to the culmination of what happened. But I was wondering, you mentioned Anna Deavere Smith, I think, in your acknowledgments, and that Smith is like an artist that I'm like perpetually fascinated by. But was there something about like the performance of the stories that was especially important to you in thinking about that? About, again, like how art can affect some kind of change?
Absolutely. I think that as much as in the digital age, we tend to think like, well, I missed that. I'll just stream it later. I'll catch it on YouTube, whatever, with no disrespect to the people who are watching virtually. I think that we forget how meaningful it is to actually be in the same space with a person, right? There's a reason that we still go to live sports events rather than just watching them on TV. There's a reason that we still go to live theater, right? There's a reason that listening to a new album on CD or on Spotify, because I just dated myself, is different than going to a concert. And I bet there are not a lot of fans who, if given the chance to go and see their favorite performer live, would turn that down. Why? Because there is something about being in the moment, being in the same physical space. And then also I think that idea that each time they sing that song, it's going to be a little bit different. Like this moment is never going to come again. If you listen to the track on Spotify or on your CD, it's going to be the same every time, right? But if you hear them sing it live, something's going to be a little different. Maybe they emphasize a different word, or there's a note, or somebody shouts, I love you in the middle, or whatever happens. And there's that idea that this is real and that this is, it's something tangible, and it's also something sort of fleeting and therefore special. And I think that applies to sort of the question that you're asking, this idea of telling stories as not being something static, but as something that evolves with you whenever it's retold. So if someone tells you a story, even if you're just at a party with somebody and they're telling you your spouse is telling the same story they've told a billion times, there's going to be something a little different each time, right? If you are watching a play that is your favorite, you'll go see it again because something's going to be a little different each time. And even in reading, so I'm thinking about what you're saying in my first novel, when you reread a book, the text is the same, but you are different. And so I'm a chronic rereader, and I find that when I go back and read my favorites, I pick out something different, either because I'm in a different headspace or because I have changed as a person. Before I was not a parent, now I am. Before, my father was alive and now he is not, and I read everything differently because of that. I think there's something about that idea that storytelling is alive. It's not just a static captured in amber. There is something about recording it, but then you're still interacting with it as you go along. I think that's the crux of it for me.
I love that. I love this idea of kind of like the liveness of even the book, right? On the one hand, there is the liveness of the storytelling, which again, in every passing, in every iteration, it's a little bit different. But even that, like the text itself changes because you change. Like it's a dynamic thing. It's, it's not just, despite the sense of like permanence attached to something like a book or document, or I'm thinking about Little Fires Everywhere, like the photograph, right?
Yeah.
I feel like throughout there's always this sense of like there are people interacting with it. There are people, and people are always changing.
I think that's exactly right. Anne Patchett, who's a writer that I love, has a saying where the meaning of a book is not between the author and the reader, it's between the reader and the book. And I really like that idea because, again, it suggests that this is an interactive thing, that, a good friend of mine is an arts educator. And one of the questions that she asks when she brings very young children into a museum is she's like, is this part of the art? Is the sign part of the art? If it's a piece of performance art, like what is the art? And in a way, what we're saying is the story is not just the static text, but it's something that's being shared. It's the act of transmitting it, of performing it in a way.
Yeah. Absolutely. I would love to ask you a million more questions, but I think that it's time to turn it over to the audience, so I will be generous.
I would love to answer any questions you have about my books or about writing or anything. Yes?
I actually have several questions from our virtual audience.
Oh,
so
wonderful.
We'll start with one, and then we'll alternate between rooms. So Angela in our virtual audience asks, what was your process for coming up with the plot of Little Fires Everywhere?
This is where I think the analogy to children becomes very apt because I have to think back, how long ago was that and what was I doing? It really came out of, as I said, that sort of sense of nostalgia, of looking back at the place that I'd come from, of having enough space where I could look back with some fondness and yet also a little bit more objectivity and think, this was a weird place that I grew up in. And I've come to believe that actually everyone's hometown is kind of weird in its own particular way. But it really came out of thinking back on this community, which I admire and respect a lot, and yet also see that it still has flaws, and trying to figure out how it had shaped me. And when I started to write the novel, I thought, well, if Shaker Heights were a person, what would it be like? And I came up with this, one of the two main characters, Mrs. Richardson. She's sort of the embodiment of the town. And then I thought, well, who would really throw her off? Because that's what fiction writers do. We cause problems in our books. And I thought this character, Mia, who is almost in some ways her polar opposite, would really, I could see them butting heads. And then as I wrote more and more, the story kind of came from those two characters, putting them together and kind of letting the sparks fly between them. A great question. Yes. Should I take a question from here?
You want me to?
So, sorry, I don't remember the first and second books, but I noticed that when I was browsing through the last book, it's written, this is a really weird question, but it's written in present tense. It kind of goes back and forth. And I have a quirk, I will read your book, but I just can't stand books that are written in present tense.
Well,
but I will read. But I mean, what's the premise? Like, why would an author write present tense versus past tense?
I wrote a lot by ear. So first I should just say with complete sincerity, no book is for everybody. If you don't like present tense, totally cool. Give it to somebody else. It's true. No book is for everybody. A professor that I love, Charles Baxter, once said that, you can't plan for every reader. His example was somebody will say, well, I really hate owls, and there's an owl in this book, so I'm not going to read it. That's cool. There's lots of other books that don't have owls in them. For me, the way that I use tense, and I'll try and be brief because I know there are other questions waiting, really has to do with the way that what story I'm telling. So in my first novel, there are two storylines. There's a present storyline and a past storyline. The past is about the parents and everything leading up to the death of one of the main characters. It's not a spoiler. It's in the first sentence of the book. And the rest is sort of what happens afterwards. And so to help the reader keep track, all of the past sections are in past tense and all of the present sections are in present tense. And if you're reading it, and if I did my job, you probably won't even notice. But it's a way of helping the reader figure out which is which. In the second novel, the entire thing is in the past tense because I wanted the story actually starts at the end and it looks back at the beginning. And because it's starting from this vantage point of everything has already happened, and now we're going to look back and see why the past tense made sense, right? We're telling a story that's already happened. This current novel, because it was influenced heavily, I think, by the moment that we're in, and I wasn't sure where our world was going. I'm still not sure where it's going. It felt right to write it in present tense, because writing it in the past tense suggested to me, think Charles Dickens, right? Think Tolstoy, the idea that we have processed this, we understand it, we've digested it, well, we're going to give it to you, and it's this thing that's over and done with. And I firmly believe that the things that are in the novel are not over and done with. They are repetitions of what's come before. They are currently going on now. It's a little scary how many things that I imagined for the novel and thought no one will ever believe that this could happen are currently happening, and some of them are in the offing. And so for me, the tense is another, it's like a color that an artist would use. You use that because it expresses something about the story. So while you don't have to read the book, I do urge you to give a book in the present tense a try and see what it does for you. This is the teacher in me speaking from before, so great. Yes.
I have another question from our virtual audience. Her name is Teresa, and she asks, this is a good follow-up, I think, to our last question. What is the best piece of writing advice you have ever received that you still use in your own writing today?
There's so much writing advice out there. The one that I keep coming back to, and when I'm asked for writing advice, is the most basic and the least comforting for every writer, which is just read a lot, write a lot. That's how you learn. You learn from other readers or from other writers' work. We learn reading that. You practice. It's just like practicing an instrument. And that's how you fine-tune your own voice. You know, you read someone that you love and then you kind of try out their voice. I went through a Kurt Vonnegut phase when I was like 15. And, you know, it obviously do not write like Kurt Vonnegut anymore, I don't think. But I figured out some things about my own voice from trying that out, right? And I think it is this process of experimenting and doing that. But the more helpful piece for, I think, beginning writers starting out is write the stories that feel the most pressing and the most important to you. Don't think about, is this going to get published? Don't think, is this marketable? Don't think, has somebody told this before better than me? It's a story that's important to you, and that's going to help you tell it well. And that, I think, is going to be sort of the thing that will keep you going. And it's not going to be told by anybody else. You're the only one who can tell it. Great question.
Hi, Celeste.
Hi.
I love your books. And
thank you.
I was at your workshop at the Belmont bookstore. I think this was pre-COVID.
It was right before COVID, I think.
And you were with the Chunky Monkeys. It was awesome. And so my question is, do you still meet with the Chunky Monkeys? Do you revise your, all your passages or your works that way? Thank you.
I should clarify for those in the audience laughing that I'm part of a writers group. And as a joke, we called ourselves the Chunky Monkeys. And had I known that anyone would ever hear that name, I think we would have tried to come up with a better name. We don't really use that name anymore, but we do. The answer is yes. We're still meeting. It's been, I think, 11 years now. So we all know each other's writing. Between us, I think we've published something like 10 or 11 books. And I find them really invaluable, both for sort of helping me literally edit passages when I'm like, is this working? Does this make sense to you? Is this just me typing all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy over and over? But also, I think, to sort of help me figure out what it is that I'm saying, because we think about writing as being something that you do alone. And actually, there's many people usually who are involved in it. Your editor, your agent, if you are fortunate to work with one, your readers, they can kind of sometimes see what you're doing more clearly than you can, and they can have faith in your project when you don't have faith in it. And so just for that alone, I hope that they will always be there. Great.
We have time for one more question, and this is from Liz in our virtual audience. Your book, Little Fires Everywhere, was made into a successful Hulu series with big stars. How much control did you have, if any, on the series?
Oh, this is a great question. And I like that she used the word control, because that was one of the things that I purposely tried to give up when I agreed to have the book adapted. My favorite adaptations often are ones in which the people who were making it were allowed some input. I think that often makes a more successful adaptation, because film and written literature are two different genres. It's almost like translating it into a different language. And so you have to, in some ways, allow those things to be said in different ways. So I started off first just thinking of it as a cover song was the analogy that I came up with. You want to hear the same basic melody, you want to have basically the same words, but you want to hear what the new artist is bringing to it. You don't just want to hear one that sounds exactly like the original, because then you would just listen to the original. And so I got to have input. What I wanted was to be one of the voices at the table, and I got to read the scripts. I got to hear the ideas. When they thought they would change something, they would run it past me and say, "What do you think?" And I would say, "Sounds great, do it." But a lot of it comes from having trust in the people that I was working with. All of the people who worked on the adaptation, starting from Reese Witherspoon on down, were readers, and they loved the book, and they really wanted to honor the spirit of the book. And I think that's what sort of allowed them to do the amazing job that they did. And I'm really grateful that I got to work with them. I think we have to stop, but I want to thank all of you. If I didn't get a chance to answer your question, I think we're going to have a reception. Come say hi, and maybe I can answer it for you in person. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to Ju-Yun for being in conversation with me.
Well, Celeste and June, that was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. I just want to reflect on one of the things that I just heard that I think is so meaningful, which is how times are changing, whether that's because of generational shifts or other factors, and how now there's a nuance to dig into deeper questions, that there's space at the table now for more people with more different views, and that you can be more than one thing at one time. And it just really reflects the complexity of all of our lives, whatever our backgrounds and whatever our voices. And thank you so much for sharing that with us. Well, I also want to express our tremendous thanks to the support of so many dedicated community leaders who serve on GBH's boards. And one of those leaders is Paul Lee. Paul has been a valued member of GBH's Board of Trustees for the past 6 years, though his role as a community leader started much longer ago than that. Paul has uplifted the Asian American community in decades of service, most recently through his work at the Boston Foundation, where he's the founder and the current chair of the Asian Community Fund, as well as the Asian Business Empowerment Council. In fact, using the word empower to describe Paul's approach is exactly right. And while I'm repeatedly impressed by the extent of Paul's network, I'm never surprised by the respect he's garnered in Boston and beyond, as his work in raising awareness for Asian American issues and elevating the community's successes is deeply admired by so many of us here tonight. Paul's extensive community involvement is such that we'd be here all night if I listed each and every organization that Paul has generally given his talents to, or every well-deserved honor that he's received. But knowing Paul, I'm not really sure he'd want us to read that list, because his impact is only matched by his modesty. So thank you, Paul, for your decades of attention to issues including civil justice and equity, domestic violence awareness, and conservation, among many others. Now, one of the awards that Paul received over his career is called the Good Guys Award, and it was given to him from the Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus. I'm going to mention this one specifically because it reflects perfectly on its recipient. Paul isn't a leader just because of all of his honors and accolades. He's a leader because he really is, in fact, a good guy, and he's become a go-to guy, whether you need help being introduced to somebody or you just really need to get something done.
In fact, when Paul was honored with the 2024 Public Service Award from the Boston Bar Association just earlier this month, here's what Paul said. "It's not about me. It's about what we can do together to improve the world that we live in." Paul's dedication to his community goes back to his childhood growing up in Boston's Chinatown and the way he experienced the power of community organizing and outreach. After attending Columbia as an undergrad during the Vietnam War, he was inspired to switch his focus from engineering to law because he thought he could make a bigger impact. As one of the first Asian American partners at a law firm in Boston, he helped to found, along with his colleague Miriam C., the Asian American Lawyers Association of Massachusetts. He was encouraged in this endeavor by his mentor, Richard Soden, one of the city's first black partners at a major firm, and he's continued passing on Richard's mantra of paying it forward ever since. A great example of paying it forward is Paul's passion project, his work in founding the Asian Community Fund of the Boston Foundation in 2020. The fund aims to increase the visibility of the Asian American community and expand resources for nonprofits that serve a community where nearly 1 in 3 Asian American residents in Boston live in poverty. That's among the highest rates of any demographic. Paul has said that through this fund, he's trying to bring Asian Americans across the state together to have a stronger and more unified voice to advocate for community needs. One of the highlights of my 16 months at GBH has been the 2 Boston Chinatown tours I've been lucky enough to receive from board members Eugene Marr and from Paul. On Paul's, we took a look at some of the extensive redevelopment work going on in Chinatown, and I saw firsthand the incredible work of the Asian Community Fund. Paul, you are unequaled as a guide and as a leader, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn about this part of the city from someone who grew up in it and still is working so hard toward its revitalization. The award that you are going to receive tonight depicts the Chinatown Gate. Now, if you've ever been on a Zoom call with Paul, you may have noticed that this image also serves as his digital background. And I can't help but think about how that reflects on where you've come from, the pride you carry, and your leadership in the community, the gate that the gate represents. It's a part of you, and you of it. So, Paul, on behalf of this year's AANHPI Annual Heritage Event Board, the GBH Educational Foundation and World, we are so honored to present you with the Chinatown Gate Award.
Let's go up here.
Well, thank you, Susan, for that wonderful introduction. But more importantly, Susan, thank you for your strong leadership of GBH, particularly during these challenging times for public broadcasting. Well, it's so great to be here this evening. I look forward to this event every year, and it's grown so much over the past 16 years under Liz Cheng's leadership. And it's so much fun each year to work with all the other volunteer community leaders on the planning committee, as well as Liz's wonderful team, to put together a thoughtful program to showcase extraordinary talent from different sectors of the Asian American community. And I think you'll agree that this year we were treated to a really thoughtful conversation between Celeste and Professor Kim. Let's take a minute and recognize them again. It is an incredible honor to receive the GBH Chinatown Gate Award. The prior recipients of the award, Leverett Wing and Auntie Helen, received well-deserved recognition because they spent many, many years working to grow support for GBH in the community. My own involvement with GBH also goes back a ways to the 1960s, but it was a little more modest. I volunteered to help in the televised auctions, and my role was to move the auction items onto camera. And I remember being dressed up in a straw hat and a vest and told to act and look festive like this, which for an awkward teenager was incredibly difficult. And come to think of it, it's pretty difficult now. But fast forward to 2024, and as Susan said, after retirement from being a corporate and transactions lawyer, my passion project is to bring the Asian American community together. And that means all of the ethnicities, all of the geographic enclaves, and the many wonderful organizations that are serving our community throughout Massachusetts, bringing everyone together so that we can have a stronger collective voice to advocate for the needs of our community. I encourage you to visit our table in the reception area for more information. But more importantly, actually, I encourage you to meet our executive director, Danielle Kim, who just this week, along with GBH's Susan Goldberg and Liz Cheng, were named to the list of the 150 most influential Bostonians by Boston Magazine. Let's give them a hand. And I just think that it's great that the goal of collaboration that the Asian Community Fund is pursuing aligns so well with GBH's engagement with the Asian American community. We're seeing so much more community involvement here at GBH with all of the communities of color, and especially the Asian community. Asians now make up 25% of the GBH Board of Advisors. And as well, 6 members of the Board of Trustees are Asian American. Pam Ettinger, me, Brian Chu, Muhammad Ali, Susan Lowe, and Renee Inamata. I'm so proud to see the depth of this engagement between GBH and the Asian community. It really makes me feel like GBH is a true partner to our community. And that makes this Chinatown Gate Award especially meaningful to me. So thank you.
Congratulations again, Paul, and thank you for everything that you do for GBH and for the AANHPI community. Congratulations. We're so grateful. Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Yu, and I am a member of GBH's Board of Advisors, and I'm also a member of this year's AANHPI Heritage Month Event Planning Committee. This evening, we've watched excerpts from GBH World's AANHPI films and heard from Celeste Ng and Professor Kim, 2 insightful and influential Asian Americans who have generously shared their personal stories and perspectives that contribute greatly to the multicultural narrative that defines America. Their successes inspire other Asian Americans to recognize and pursue their limitless potential. Whether it's local news on GBH 89.7, its National Icon series on PBS, GBH2, and GBH44, or its richly diverse content on World GBH, GBH produces for just about every platform and device. Whether it's Frontline, Nova, Masterpiece, American Experience, Antiques Roadshow, American Reframed, Doc World, Stories from the Stage, and so much more, GBH discovers and amplifies multicultural voices such as those we've heard tonight. GBH focuses on what matters to you through stories that are produced by GBH and World and shared with audiences around the globe. We invite you to join GBH and World in their work serving communities across the country. If you live in Boston, you can volunteer your time at GBH or donate your support to programming and events that help us illuminate, appreciate, and celebrate differences. Please consider joining our public media family and supporting at any level. And tonight we have a very special offer. When you contribute $75 or more to GBH, you can receive an autographed copy of Celeste Ng's most recent novel, Our Missing Hearts, as a thank you gift. Support GBH at $6.25 a month as a GBH sustainer, or $75 all at once. And we will send you this book to add to your collection or to gift it to a family member or friend. You can do this by texting the letters GBH to 800-204-3811 using the keyword GBH to make a donation, or you can scan the QR code up here on the screen. And as a reminder, we'll share all of tonight's resources with you in our follow-up email. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope to see you again soon. And now I'll turn it back over to Liz Cheng.
Fabulous. Isn't she fabulous? I think we should hire her to do on-air stuff. Well, wasn't this a spectacular evening? Thank you so much, Emily, for your words of support, and congratulations to our friend Polly on a well-deserved honor. Yay! And how about another round of applause for the incredible conversation and lots to think about from Celeste and June. Thank you so much, our new friends of GBH. And thank you also to our Heritage Planning Committee. I suspect that they have already started working on next year's event, right? Am I right? Yes. And last but not least, deep appreciation to the GBH staff, everyone that you see here in terms of our technical crew, but most especially Amy Axelrod, Kate Kataja, and Liz Haggard for their help in making this such a success. And then, of course, many, many thanks to Susan Goldberg for all her support of all that we do here, and most especially this event. So without further ado, no more left on my list of things to say. So, Shafamba, let's eat.